thoughtful way to sort of conclude that panel. But now, get a chance to open it up to you guys, because I'd like to hear what are some of the questions that you had coming up as you're having this conversation. There's a microphone right there. It will come to you if you put up your hand.
Thank you very much. My name is Hannah Bell. I am a recovering politician. And so I love data as well, and my area of interest is housing and poverty. And so a really quick bit of context for housing in PEI and the immigration experience in PEI. We've gone from 150,000 islanders in 2012 to 175,000 islanders today, with a projection of 200,000 by 2030. It is the most exponential growth in the country, and that growth is entirely through immigration because our birth-death rate is actually negative. At the same time, we hit our housing crisis in 2018 when we went below 1% vacancy rate, and we haven't really moved ever since. So the short-term pain is getting rather long here. And you talked about doubling of house rental. That is the reality of the situation here. One of the big questions that I come back to over and over in this space is how important it is that when we talk about all of the people that want to come and move to Canada, they're all then, as Canadians, deserving of equal human rights. And there's a very clear statement that housing is a human right, and access to healthcare is a human right, and being treated with dignity and respect is a human right. As a Canadian, we all get that, whether you're new or you're old or you're first generation or whatever that may be. But we're not seeing our government reflect that in its decision making. And I really appreciate Shamira's comments around the steps, the collaborative approach, needing to remove those barriers. But there needs to be some leverage there. We don't want to see imposition of a top-down, but at the same time, the federal government is the funder for the programs that are delivered provincially. We're seeing some really strong action right now from Minister Fraser, where he's saying, you know, I'm expecting you to meet this criteria to get the housing funding, and if you don't meet it, you're not getting it. That's within his remit to do, and that's really powerful. How can we get the message through to, at those different levers of power, that we need to see the action as a priority at the decision-making table, because you can do two hard things at the same time. You can increase and manage economic prosperity and deliver the programs and services as a priority to fulfill the needs that are imposed upon us as Canadians that we need to fill. We can't keep kicking this down the road. So a lot of context there, but my main question is from a context of we can't afford not to do this. Can we please do more than one hard thing at a time?
Thanks for the easy question. I think, Shamira, that is a question to you, because it is a question of program design, policy design. It is a question of, you have governments who say that they're interested in doing this, in going about it, but you're seeing kind of a lack of delivery, if you will, on that. What does it look like for a government to take this seriously, to go like, okay, their priorities are in the right place? What would that look like?
I think I started talking about that, probably the first question is cough. I don't see the different ministers coming together talking in silos. I really think this is a Council of the Federation having a broad, influential conversation so that you don't have the walking away of the different provinces and ministries. I think it needs to sit there in terms of, a joint conversation about housing, immigration, poverty, whatever it takes in terms of where this country is going to be. Because this is not a short-term situation. It's our economic sustainability. And where do we want to be in the long term as a country to remain competitive? And the only way we'll remain competitive, and we've talked about this for the last hour and a half, is around immigration, who are contributing, and Canadians who will be retiring and who will need a pension in order to survive. So I think it starts with the Prime Minister and COF and having that conversation, and immigration, housing being part of that agenda, not sitting in 4 different places. And then when you take each province, I think, again, it needs to sit in the Premier's office, where Cabinet Office and the politicians are talking and bringing all the ministries together. I don't think that this can happen one by one, because we have fragmented narratives, and then we never get together because we just kick it down. The Fed say it's the provinces say it's the municipalities.
Charles Tupper's fault.
But then that's where you started. You know, we say the regulators basically are independent. They're actually not. The provinces delegate, and we all keep on saying it's everybody else's fault.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to start.
Well, Nicholas, maybe I'll put this to you in terms of, because you've done a lot of reporting in terms of the immigrant advocacy organizations, whether it's like the lobby groups or organizations that work directly with immigrants who are saying, just give us the support, we'll take it from here, but we don't have that support. What are you hearing from those organizations?
I think it's interesting, even according to some of the public opinion polls, they also, one also had the breakdown of Canadian-born and immigrants' views on whether we have too many immigrants, too few immigrants, or the right number. Even some of the newcomers also feel there are too many. But what I find interesting, each generation of immigrants, you would hear, they want to close the door, to the ones after them too, right? Because of competition, limited resources. But that's what, if you look at some of the social media groups, they are complaining about, okay, we already have a long wait lines, a huge backlog, so don't take in more applications. Give us, process our applications first. So there's also that, competition, feeling of competitions among the immigration communities, immigrant communities too.
Yeah,
for sure.
Taleeb, do you want to try to answer this one?
Sure.
It's to you.
Well, look, I think it's a lovely idea, and in a different world, I think what Shamira is proposing would actually work, where you'd have everybody come to the table and agree on a plan. And I think part of the frustration is right now that there are such different polarities between the different provinces that the federal government has had to make individual deals with individual provinces and individual deals with individual municipalities to deal with things like housing. And we're going to keep doing that, because at some point you have to say, well, either we wait for everybody to come together and we figure this thing out, or we just get to building solutions, and you just have to do. And so it is frustrating, I recognize, for some provincial premiers that we have had to go directly to municipalities to invest in housing. It's a reality that we are facing, but we have to do it, because otherwise, at the end of the day, as the recovering politician in the back rightly pointed out, nothing gets done. And so if we can use that as a bit of a carrot to say, look, where there are good actors that are prepared to change the way that they have done things historically on the ground in terms of housing policy, we will be there to invest in additional densification, in additional supports that are required to do that. And that is an unfortunate kind of consequence of when you cannot have consensus at the Council of the Federation. Doesn't mean you don't keep trying. It doesn't mean that you can't walk and chew gum at the same time. I think you have to try. That you have to keep pushing provinces. And the beauty of immigration is that you've seen every province saying we still need people desperately, right? How do you then align housing policy with immigration policy, with support for healthcare, et cetera, et cetera? But that necessitates provinces being willing to say to the federal government, yes, we are prepared to accept that you're going to hold us accountable for some things. Right? This last healthcare deal was a huge deal in that regard, because it was the first time the federal government said, look, we are going to hold you to certain standards in terms of how you're going to do certain things. And look, we've seen pretty substantial uptake. But it comes down to being willing to take difficult steps, which we are trying to do in many of the ways, but the voice in the back, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Annabelle.
Annabelle's point is exactly right. Like, we can't just keep waiting to do, we have to just do. And I hope we get to the place that Shamira has talked about, but in the interim, we're going to just have to keep pushing.
Nicholas, your hand went up.
Yeah, one quick comment. I think for a long, long time, we overlooked the complexity of immigration. We look, I think that's what I meant when I, at the beginning of this panel, I talk about silos, because we just, looked at immigrants as an add-on rather than being part of the society. So that's when we make policies about healthcare education, housing, all these hot topics these days. We never included them, in our thinking. But I feel like, that's what I meant. Like, this is a time of opportunities for us to reimagine, when we think of, when policymakers actually try to think of policies they include, they have, at the back of their mind, they have the interests of, immigrants, like how they play out in the housing crisis, plan ahead, include them in the formula. And I think, having all parties sitting down, and when I mentioned, the complexity, because, I think a lot of people just think of immigration as like about setting the annual targets, looking at credentials recognition. We're done. That's
Right.
it.
That's where it
But
starts.
it's way
That's where it
more,
starts.
to it than just that. Yeah.
Look what you did, Hannah. Thank you. That was a great question. Okay, so a couple more hands are going up.
Hi, I'm Kelly Wilhelm, and I'm a recovering political staffer. So
Is there like a rehab program nearby? or something?
I feel the need
What's
to
going
say
on?
it. So
Yeah.
I live in Ottawa, so I just left the hill, as we say in Ottawa,
Yes.
a few months back. I'm a lifelong arts and cultural person. Cultural policy is my passion and my obsession. I'm also heading up a new cultural policy hub at OCAD University in Toronto, so if anyone has any interest in that from our sector, love to talk. But my question is drawing that line to another policy domain that you just mentioned, Nicholas. So we talked about housing, we talk about many different domains. I want to talk about culture for a second, because the point that you've made, one of them is this is about much more than commodification of immigrants, right? And the individual as a person coming into a community into which he or she or they would like to belong. If we accept that cultural policy is there and public funding in Canada for culture is there for reasons around building social cohesion, transmitting and sharing identity, knowing one another and belonging in our communities, then what's the link that you might make? And Elamin, I'd ask you too, you're at the national broadcaster. Taleeb, you're the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage. What can we do in the cultural sector? What would a responsibility of an organization like the Confederation Center of the Arts, for example, in this domain? And how can we draw that line more clearly between what we're trying to do in our cultural policies and how we're trying to build our nation of including immigration in this way?
That's a great question. Tal, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think you are spot on. One of the most, I think, interesting parts of immigration is how do you start to have people that have come to this country from different parts of the world through different histories share their stories and tell their stories. And I'm not just talking about the story of their immigration or story of their route, but their histories, their artistic expression, their dance, their music, their storytelling, as a way to actually do not just the hard work of building social cohesion and understanding, but also the idea of the promotion of culture as a new face of Canada. Places like this have to evolve. And they are evolving because as you see the changing nature of Canada and you see the diversity in this country, you have to adapt. If you're going to be a place that talks about telling the story of arts and culture anywhere in this country, you have to adapt. And that also takes itself down to community theaters, community art galleries, community places of gathering, where communities are evolving. And you start to make people feel like they belong by showing that they have a place in those places. And the advantage that gives you then is that it enables different artists from those places to emerge, to be part of the cultural scene of the country and of the globe. And that is something that I think is often overlooked. I think it is often forgotten as part of the journey of building the type of socially inclusive place that we want to build. And it's actually the easiest. It is actually the easiest place to do it because people love nothing more than to share their music, their dance, their stories, their theater, because it is imbued in them. And that becomes something that if we lean into a lot more, I think some of the challenges that we see around how do we make people feel like they belong, you actually start inviting people into a conversation, into a moment, into creativity that otherwise you may not have. So I think that's spot on. I think we need to do a lot more of it.
Taleeb has a sort of optimistic answer to that. I'll give you the, it's not pessimistic. I don't think that's the right answer, but it's a hell of a challenge. And when I say it's a hell of a challenge, I mean, I was talking to a friend who works at another broadcaster recently, and they were telling me about some of the data that they saw internally about the largest sort of immigration centers that are going to reshape the population of this country over the next 10 years or so. And what it ends up meaning is you have to figure out literally the programming that you're making, that you're putting on television, that you're putting on the radio, that you're putting on podcasting, wherever you are, that caters to these populations and go, okay, like if some of our largest immigration centers are the Philippines and Nigeria, what are we doing to have conversations with those people as a media organization? I don't know if you can speak to this, Nicholas, but like the idea, like how does the Toronto Star sort of adjust to like a rapidly changing consumer base, like the idea of like how does your journalism end up changing? Literally, what are the stories that you end up covering? What are the TV shows you end up green lighting versus killing? Like those are really important questions that those networks then have to figure out. And quite often you get this pushback, this like really like snarky corner of Twitter that's like, who's this TV show for? Like it never occurs to someone that's maybe not for them, right? It's not for you, that's fine. There's so many things that you still have, I don't know, everybody loves Raymond, man, you know what I mean? There's still, but there are, I love that show. I don't know why I use that as the example. But there are still so many different avenues of cultural engagement that you have that maybe these newcomers don't necessarily have. So when you see a program, you go like, who's watching that? If the answer is not you, that's fine. But there's clearly some kind of indication that there's an audience for this. This is engaging with a question in a population that does not necessarily feel engaged with. And you're going to start to see that a lot more from, I think, every media organization in this country. I don't know if you have anything.
Can I actually add a couple of points? One is, I think, as Canada has grown more mature, I think the multicultural relationship between people is no longer, Chinese community to the quote-unquote mainstream community. But I think we have evolved. Now what we need to do is to how each immigrant community, each cultural community relates to one another. Just because of this, the mass, the size has grown, is no longer, how they individually relate to the mainstream institution, right? So that's one point I'd like to make. And the second thing is, in terms of programming, I know the Institute of Canadian Citizenship, they actually have a program where they work with different community cultural groups for free passes for newcomers to use those space. I think that's a really brilliant program to make them feel welcomed, and they have a spot there in the society, in the community, to groom that sense of belonging. And in terms of your question about the programming, I remember when I started covering the immigration beat, before I actually took up that job in 2003, I was offered, to be the Chinese issue reporter, which I turned down because my argument was, why did we further segregate our readers when we should rather, bring communities together? So I counter to my editor saying, why, given our shared history of immigration, maybe we should restart the immigration beat to bring communities together so we can relate to one another better, and to be, if you're native born, put yourself into the shoes of the immigrant experience. That's, I think, the way we should approach it, like to bring people together rather than pigeonhole each of them into their little space.
Shamira, do you want to add anything on this?
No, I think everybody did a great job.
I agree. I totally agree. Also, can I tell you about this restaurant that is like near my house? It's just like, it's a great restaurant. Great little Ethiopian restaurant. And one of the things that happen at this restaurant is that there's like a world-class Ethiopian fusion jazz musician who just like lives around the corner. And he just like needed a cultural space where you could just play some fusion, some jazz fusion. But what ended up happening is that like, you have all these like world-renowned jazz musicians who travel, and then they come to Toronto and they go, I'm gonna go to Woodbine and Danforth where nothing happens except this tiny little restaurant, and then they play there. And to me, that is like a reimagination of space, where something genuinely magical and transformative happens every Tuesday. And if you're walking past it, you wouldn't even necessarily know what's going on in there, but if you go in there, like it's kind of mind-blowing. And like those are some of the cultural opportunities that we have around us, because that immigrant workforce that has come here are also artists, are also musicians, are thinkers, movie makers, and there's a grand opportunity to use their abilities and their sense of story, I think, to enhance our own.
And can I add one more thing?
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, of course.
You get me started going, so
Yeah.
I'll stop.
We did it now.
And I think Canada is built at the personal level. I think the example I like to give is I live in a townhouse complex in a row of 5 houses. My family is from Hong Kong. One family is from Trinidad. One family is from Brazil. One is from the Philippines. One from Scotland. We have conversations, about the royal families with my Scottish neighbor, and we talked about, President Duarte, with the Filipino family, about some of those, questionable human rights records, and we talk about the Olympics, when it was held in Brazil, and I think how communities are built, how the country is built, is really at the very personal level with our neighbors, with our colleagues, with our friends, and that's how you build. And I just feel if you can, just open up your space, and share your experience and perspectives with others, that's how we can, build.
Yeah.
Despite our differences, we can build a stronger country.
Yeah, I agree.
We got
there's
over
a
here.
question. Oh, over here. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Watson, and my wife and I moved here 2 years ago from Belgium.
Nice.
So, as Nicholas would say, we're an old stock.
New old stock.
Group.
New old stuff, yes.
I was wondering if we could talk about employers and the role they play in this debate. I'm actually representing the Study and Stay program here on the island, so that's working with the Collège de Lille, Holland College, and UPI for international students that are in their final year of study and are trying to move into the job market. And I hear from a lot of employers, oh, we need people. And I hear from a lot of students, we can't find the job. And I think one of the reasons here on the island is that a lot of the businesses are small, medium-sized enterprises. They don't necessarily have an HR staff person. When they're looking through resumes, they're like, ooh, what's this? And do I understand it? And then they might go for an international student, and then they're told, oh, yeah, and you need to do this, and then there's the PNP program, and then you need to fill in this form, and you need to do that. And they go, whoa, I'm probably not going to go down that route. Oh, look, there's a Canadian. We'll just go there. It's easier. How do we engage with employers, not necessarily those large corporations that have lawyers, know how to do this, but small companies? We just heard on the radio about small mills in Belfast, which is a growing company here, and they're exporting all over the world. They don't have an HR manager necessarily either, but they need engineers. How do we make those connections? And this links back again. A lot of my students are actually quite mature. They have 5 to 10 years experience back home. They've got lots of diplomas. Can't get those recognized. We understand the issues around that, and that's already been addressed. But how do local employers here understand the qualifications that some of these students have, and how do we give them the confidence to make that step into unfamiliar territory to maybe get the students in? They don't want more jobs working at a fast food outlet. They've done retail. They're now qualified. They've done their Canadian qualification. How do we engage employers to give them the confidence to appoint them at the level where they can really work?
In the brief time that you laid out the problem, Shamira's already solved it, which is really great. So, Shamira, would you like to take this
It's
one?
not great sitting next to you watching me do the notes. So the Study and Stay program is a mechanism for students to stay, and as I think most of us may know, started about 3 years ago, although, there's some challenges around housing and issues like that. But in my mind, there are different ways to try and bring employers into the fore. The first is the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, because in fact, what's been happening there, other than conversations that CFIB has with government around what's required, around red tape, etc., is where CFIB could play a role with the advisors across the country, including PEI, to talk about how the smaller businesses could play a role. So that you're not talking about HR departments, but how employers or small employers in different sectors could get together and have a conversation. So there isn't competition amongst the employers. They're getting together to talk about how do we bring people in, do the interviews, and support people who might not have been interviewed for the type of way, the way we do it in Canada. So that's the first at the very macro level. At sort of the meso level, post-secondary institutions already have career offices. They work with domestic students. There is no difference here. My hope is, and aspiration is, that post-secondary institutions don't divide up the registrar's offices and the international offices, that they work together to try and figure out how best to integrate international students into the workplace. The other is internship programs. So, the federal government funds summer programs as do provinces, and there could be a special program where government is putting funding on the table anyway to have a program for international students or others in terms of giving them workplace experience, because they're hard workers, they're here already. The best way to see if somebody can do the job well is to have them in the workplace for 10 to 12 weeks, because they get hired. All the evidence shows that. So really, in my mind, it's from the macro to micro. At World Education Services, and you could take a look at something called #EmployersWork, is a program that we started about 2 years ago with a few municipalities in Ontario and in New Brunswick, where we work with the local municipality, the Workforce Development Office, the local post-secondary institutions, colleges and universities, and the settlement organizations to come around the table to have a conversation around that same question. We need employees, where are the immigrants? And the conversation is, what's the best way forward? An employer handbook that talks about what the mechanisms are to bring people in. Where do you find them? How do you do the English assessment, etc.? And it must be working, because when we put a call out, because we don't fund these organizations, with 14 different municipalities from across the country applying, saying they want to do this work. And it could multiply. So I think that really it's the macro to the micro, where on the ground, it could work if you start smaller programs, test out what's working, and then just basically scale up and out.
If I can just pick up on something that Martin was saying, the idea of part of this is trying to change culture specifically when it comes to employers who maybe see hiring some of these people as a burden, as an admin burden, as a sort of just my work process will be easier if I just hire somebody and I can recognize their name. I don't have to fill out all these forms. How do you maybe change or challenge a mindset of someone who says, it's a little bit too much work, I don't want to do that?
So what's interesting for me is I haven't faced that from employers, at least in conversations that we've had with employers.
Yeah.
There hasn't been that pushback from employers. In fact, at least in my experience, it's, we want to hire them. What's the best way? So the paperwork, and I hate to do this in terms of, the federal government or other government representatives. I know.
You love to do it.
But it all is about policies and the red tape. So as an example, we had a fairly large employer who talked about, well, we had issues with housing. We decided to offer housing to students who were coming in or immigrants. And we were told, well, there were taxation implications and you had to fill out 27,000 pieces of documents and report in, and they said, I give up. So again, it's a matter of red tape and how many policies are put in place by whether it's the federal or provincial government. So that's another way to do it, is, identify these policies or programs and then influence. I mean, I know that we're going to finish the conversation pretty soon, but one of the things that I haven't talked about, and it becomes really important, is the voices of the individuals who are being impacted. Because here we're talking all about, what should government do, what should organizations do, what should employers do. But have we actually talked to the individuals who are being impacted? And, the voices of the immigrants. Now, I know the federal government has done this with the most recent report, where they will have an immigrants advisory council. But the whole saying of nothing for us without us becomes really important. And so, they will have some ideas, and it's just something that we need to think about very concretely, is, how do we make sure that we have conversations with people who are being impacted? Because they might have ideas, they will have ideas in terms of what it takes. And sometimes some things that we think may be difficult to do, they might have easier solutions. So it's just something that I wanted to leave with us, and I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, let's, the microphone's back there. Yeah.
My name is Khalid Shami. I'm a technologist. My question here, what government, nonprofit organization are doing to educate people about the danger of where an algorithm can change or manipulate people thinking? What regulation? Social media, there's no regulation here. In Canada, they're not playing, the policy is not strong on them. Anybody can post anything, and nobody can stop that. And we can see that right now, they are dividing the community. Thank you.
The question is about technology and how it divides us. It certainly can do that. I'm going to put it to the former tech executive among us.
Well, former tech executive and now the guy at Heritage who has to think about
say,
C18, C11, and online harms. Look, you make a really good point. One of the things that is happening right now is there is a real conversation going about how do we address online harms? How do we address exactly the challenges that you're seeing? The large platforms are there to make money. They're not there to really solve the social problem. I mean, the reality is that they have shareholders, they make money, they do what they do. There is a very real, it's almost existential risk in terms of the consequences of not having different quality, verified voices at the table, right? How we consume our news in this country is changing. I mean, we've seen hundreds of journalists, lose their jobs. We've seen the death of journalism in small communities, small publications. And so when that is replaced by people that can sit in their basement and say whatever they want and ends up on the internet as fact, you end up in a very dangerous place. So it's up to us to also, through this process, curate and educate one another as to what is real and what is not. But this is where the whole conversation about online harms and regulation actually becomes part of it. And it's a very difficult place for government to be, right? Because on one hand, people say you're trying to control freedom of speech. But there is a very real difference between the question of how do you protect freedom of speech and how do you use your ability to speak freely to spread misinformation, to denigrate others, to spread hate. And it's a balance that I think is a very, very uncomfortable conversation that we need to have as a country. We're going to have it as a country. Because the consequences of what can happen online can and have been fatal. If you think about marginalized communities in this country, you think about the 2S LGBTQI plus community, you think about women, you think about indigenous communities, you think about what is happening right now in the Middle East. The way in which this stuff is amplified by platforms and amplified by, there are Russian disinformation, misinformation campaigns, you're seeing this from other foreign actors. It's a very, very real problem, and it's not one that Canada can fight alone, but we're going to give it our best shot, and it's going to need every single person in this room and others to speak up and say we actually need this.
Let's keep it moving with the questions, though. The microphone, yes.
Hi. Oh, that's really loud. My name is Lily Campbell. I had a question. It kind of goes back to big corporations. So, Shamira, you had said these big corporations, they hire for minimum wage for 110 hours a week for immigrants. How do you regulate that? How do you say that's not okay? You can't do that anymore? Because I don't really know how to do that. Is that government? Is that other parts of civil society? Is that the public? Whose responsibility is that, and how do we fix it?
That's actually, that confusion is really valuable. The idea of people don't know which levers to pull in order to enact those kinds of changes.
So that's a complex question and not a simple answer. So what we do know is that each one of the provinces has an Employment Standards Act. That's really clear. how many hours you work, the breaks, what you pay for overtime. So that's clear. And hopefully, individuals who are working know about the ESA employment standards. So maybe that's the first thing, is that people need to know what their rights and obligations are. The complexity comes from the fact that when you have temporary foreign workers who are here on a temporary basis, basically linked to an employer, and their motivation for even coming here on a temporary basis is to get immigration status, they're not going to complain because they're in a vulnerable state. And if they do complain about, I'm not actually getting minimum wage or I'm working long hours, they will lose their ability to become permanent. And the same for international students, where international students are being told that when they come here, it's $10,000 is all they need in order to survive. They can't. And so the federal government used to give them the ability to work 20 hours a week, and then lifted that to unlimited hours. And many post-secondary institutions can't control whether they're attending classes or not. So you end up with international students working, I exaggerated when I say 100 hours, they couldn't really manage, but they work many, many hours, 3 jobs. And again, they're in the same situation as a temporary foreign worker. So I don't have a simple answer other than the federal government needs to rethink, the threshold in terms of how many hours can one work and go to school and still survive, and is it $10,000, that's the right threshold. And I think information to employers in terms of, what's happening here, because employers are there to make money, obviously, for shareholders, and they need to make sure that they are able to fulfill that. And so it's a complex situation in terms of, where we are going to take this. My hope is that you don't end up with a situation where you continue to bring in temporary foreign workers, where you basically have many international students, you put them into the labor market because we're desperate, and we don't look at the other side of what happens with, vulnerable workers. There could be a way to do this without individual students going and complaining, and then their implications are there organizations that can be their voice, where they can influence government to change policies. And that's the best way to do it, is to influence public policy and being out there up front. We know it, we talk about it, but who's actually taking those voices forward?
Do you guys want in on this answer?
Yeah, and in terms of people on work permits here in Canada, where there's temporary foreign workers and international students, migrants advocates have been, urging the government to grant status, permanent status upon arrival, just so people who are in precarious immigration, status, with precarious immigration status, could, feel like they have the power and to speak out and to speak up, when there's, abuse or exploitation. And when it comes to the immigrants and Canadian workers, I think we've seen the lack of enforcement, in terms of employment standards, because obviously I think that the voices of employers much stronger, they're more organized, versus individual workers. But I think one way to counter that, maybe stronger unions, representations would be a solution. Yeah, to at least have some sort of baseline enforcement.
So we have time for one more question. This could be you.
Elizabeth, retired nurse from Ontario who retired to Nova Scotia, and I was quite prepared to continue working in nursing, but it would have cost $725 to become registered in Nova Scotia. I was 65. I thought I can be a pensioner now, and it was just prior to COVID. So if I hadn't left Ontario, I would have been working.
Yeah.
My challenge for nursing and other healthcare professions, there's no ability to move seamlessly between provinces. It's absolutely ridiculous. At one point, we had a Canadian national nursing exam. It became American, but when I graduated, all I had to do was apply to BC, and they'd look at my test scores and say, yes, you know, you can work in BC. That's gone. The situation working in healthcare now has worsened in the last 3 years, but at one point in Ontario, one stat was there as many registered nurses not working in nursing as are. So what are we doing to entice those who are already registered and able to work? And the conditions are terrible in hospitals. My neighbor is a 3-year grad, been graduated 3 years. She has told me that in her local hospital, which I could access, at night, she's the only RN.
Oh my God.
The only registered nurse in a small rural hospital with inpatients.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. At one point in Ontario, it was physicians who regulated the number of billing numbers. You can't practice unless you can bill. So what are we doing to make it easier for people, Canadian trained, to move? And my final point is that I was at the International Council of Nurses, International Congress in Montreal. Justin made an appearance. Then representatives from countries who are the donors of internationally educated nurses are desperate to retain their nurses.
Yeah.
And Canada's going out and recruiting them. We can produce enough nurses, but we can't retain them because the conditions are not good and we can't move freely across the country.
Everyone knows the
Confederation's fault.
I was going to say, the sexiest phrase in Canadian politics is interprovincial trade, I believe, and then right after that it's, hey, how is federalism doing? I do think there's something about the fact that all of these problems, and I don't just mean immigration, it's like whether it's immigration or healthcare or trade in general, it comes back to a lot of some of the fundamentals of the design of the Federation.
Yes.
And so, Taleeb, I'd like to give that really easy question to you about reimagining sort of, what are some of the limitations of the way that we've set up the Federation now, because it's true that we have to allot for each jurisdiction's desires to manage their own jurisdiction. That's what the division of powers is all about. But also, there's all kinds of limitations this brings up.
Yeah, and we can always blame Tupper.
Charles Tupper.
This is a messy confederation. It is a federation of, in some, in some sense, everyone that came together around a specific ideal, but with very, very different ways to get to that outcome, and that has manifested itself as we see it in very different and sometimes divergent regional specificities.
Yeah.
Sometimes neighboring provinces, I look at BC and Alberta, have completely fundamentally different and diverging views on, governments have different and diverging views on things like climate change.
Sure.
You look at Atlantic Canada, you look at the differences between how people in Newfoundland and Labrador perceive themselves versus PEI. These are realities that were created when Confederation came to be. And if you were to redesign the whole thing today, would you have, 4 Atlantic provinces? Would you have 1? Would you have, all of these things are, but they're not up for debate anymore. It is, we are where we are. So the question is, how do you make the Federation stronger? I think the first thing really is we have to accept that there is a need. And now I'm speaking, this to be clear, this is not the position of the government of Canada, this is the position of Taleeb. So take it for what it's worth. We have to be able to sit down and accept that there are things we are not going to change. We are not in a position right now where provinces are going to say, here, we're going to give power back to the federal government. Mm-hmm. But you're also not in a place where the federal government is prepared, I think, to devolve a heck of a lot more downward. I think we are where we are. So the question is, what are the things that we can work on together? And how do you start to look at issues that are existential to the future of the country, whether it is climate change, whether it is healthcare, whether it is immigration, as Shamira has pointed out, whether it is the very question of interprovincial trade, whether it is issues related to global trade and Canada's role in it and how we participate across the Federation in doing some of these things, whether it is issues related to national infrastructure. And say, look, we are not going to be able to solve the grand plan of what the Canada could be if these guys all disappeared and we started over. Mm-hmm. But to say, if we agree on what the problem set is for Canadians, if we agree on what the problem set is, that the vast majority of Canadians from coast to coast to coast are facing, not just today, but that we expect them to face in the decades ahead, how do we frame within the existing structures the types of conversations and rooms and funding models around those things that get to good outcomes? And I think that, again, goes back to the point I made earlier. It takes people having humility in their own sort of station. It takes having a degree of trust and confidence in others. But I think it also takes centering Canadians in that debate. No federation, no system is perfect. My goodness, I would pick this one over the US one all day long. But it doesn't mean we can't improve it. It doesn't mean that we don't all have a role to play in pushing a bit harder on each other to say there's got to be a way for us to unblock some of this stuff.
I love the word that Taleeb used, Shamira, the word messy, because it's true. I'm actually almost like romantic about how messy it is. It's messy. It is messy. But that is the realm of romance. Is it functional is a different question. And so I think like we have to contend with, at what point is it like, oh, this is just the regular messiness of coming together of different interests and convergences and how they converge. But when you have a willing nurse who's willing to work and is not able to because she has to pay nearly $1,000 in order to get that registration, you go, I don't know if this is functional. This is no longer about messiness. This is actually about actual functionality. Is the federation functioning? And so I want to put that easy question either to you, well, I was going to put it to you, Shamira, but you raise your hand, Nicholas.
Do you mind?
Go
Oh my
ahead.
God, go.
Because I think it raises a very interesting question for all of us, as Canadians, what we really value. What I mean is, for example, in China, when Beijing wanted to build the dams, right, they removed everyone. And it happened quickly. When, COVID started, they built a hospital in 7 days.
Yeah.
We know it takes effort, it takes consensus, it takes time in any democracy to solve our problems because we have this value, we value respect, right?
Consensus.
Try to be sensitive, right?
Yeah.
So, do you like the Chinese system more? When things could happen, you can just work tomorrow, or they force you to work from one hospital to another with given no choice. Like, do you prefer that system, or you prefer what we have? Like,
Somewhere in the middle, preferably.
Yeah, so it speaks to the yin and yang balance, right? Again, how do we find that balance? There's always, I feel like in any governments, too, here, including Canada, we always swing from one extreme to the other extreme, and you never hardly, could stay for long in the middle, in the balance, that point.
That's true. That's a really good point.
It's messy, but it's complex. And you raise so many issues, and I'll try and tackle one at a time and try and make it as simple as possible, but it takes a longer conversation. That's what I've been doing ever since I came back from government to US. So the first is around the whole issue of internationally educated health professionals, nurses including, where maybe many people don't know that the government of Canada has signed the Lisbon Recognition Convention. Look it up. And it's a legal agreement that stipulates that any individual coming from another country to Canada and is wanting to go to post-secondary or wants to get licensed should not face additional barriers. We signed that document. US hasn't. Not many people know about this, and nobody has actually taken any of these regulators to court. You have to wonder why. So that's just something that is important to note.
Who would take them to court?
Basically, the individual. The individual will say you're putting
Undue
barriers,
hardship.
undue hardship. Hard to basically demonstrate what that looks like because, regulators might have to get their own lawyers and then you have a conversation. It'd be interesting to see what would happen because it's a legal document.
But the mechanism exists.
The mechanism exists. Two is that the whole issue of, internationally trained and then, nurses in Ontario, where it's so interesting in that we talk about complexity and simplicity during COVID. All of a sudden, like a miracle, regulations changed. And you ended up with individuals who hadn't quite finished school who could go into the system and start working. You could have worked. You had regulations that changed that said you didn't really need to have language proficiency as long as you're working in English at Tim Hortons. You could get licensed and work, etc. So, you know, it got really interesting to me that during COVID, all of a sudden, you know, you put as many people into the system. And what's so sad right now, and now we talk about ethical recruitment in terms of going to other countries, where they're losing out because they can't afford to pay, is that every single province is going to these countries and saying, come on over, and then I don't know how many of these individuals are actually able to practice, because once they get here, it's not that easy. And so for me, as you know, I said, it's messy and complex, and I'm not actually sure who's getting a hold of this particular issue, because we are doing unethical recruitment province by province, and bringing people in when we have our own health professionals, whether they came in as PSW workers or home care providers, who can't get licensed, and you bring new people in, where we have our own nurses who have to work 12-hour days with absolutely no time off, but agencies can pay them triple the amount. They'll only work 6 months a year, and then, you know, it's complex. There are union issues, there are policy issues, and actually, I don't have an answer to this other than, you know, just keep on peeling the onion to make sure that we can understand what the issues are, who's accountable, and move forward.
In public health, we call them wicked problems.
Wicked problems, that's what it is.
Yeah. It's easy to blame Charles Tupper. I think it's easy to blame the design of the Federation. What is a little bit harder to do is engage each other in our part in that conversation. I hope that each of these perspectives has given you a place to start, just how you think about immigration, the role that it serves in this country. Because every single time that I've asked Shamira a question, she was like, look, it's complex. And I appreciate that reminder. I appreciate that reminder because sometimes I'm looking for the easy answer, and sometimes it takes just a preface of the answer, being like, before I get into it, just so you know, it is really complicated. I appreciate you guys being here. I really appreciate this panel. Nicholas, Taleeb, Shamira, thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.